Hello and welcome to the Musicians Weekly, Volume 17. How to discover unknown music of real substance. That's a question many musicians are carrying inside themselves. And of course, you can always follow some advice from somewhere. And very often even things are rediscovered that are already rediscovered or that played for the first time that are already there. And many people claim that they are the first. And many people claim for some minor discoveries that it is a real great thing. Very often they believe that, in some cases they pretend that. And so how to be sure that you really find something of real great historical importance? First of all, you have to leave away any kind of prejudices of ideas how this has to be. It's in a way the same as if you think what kind of music is modern, the next thing to come. So when we speak about modern music, there is always, almost always, there is already an idea how this modernism has to be. So for a very long time, for example, we had this idea that modernism means that music is extremely dissonant, extremely unpleasant, and extremely dystopian. And dystopian, of course, means against human being. Many intellectual people even don't realize anymore that it's dystopian. So they don't realize that some things are unmusical because they have this idea what should be a modern piece of music. And so when Luigi Nono came, who was a very gifted composer, no doubt, and he was such a radical ideologist that he would refuse anything that has any obvious connections to elder music. So for some moment in history, this was possible. So everything had to be totally cut off the past. But it cannot work for a long time. And so the kind of what is modern became a cliche of what we call the Donaueschingen music, for example. And so everything that was, for example, too beautiful, was too balanced, that was too friendly, would have been refused. Of course, this cannot stay forever. But for example, the machine music of the 1920s, and these pieces by Edgar Varese and Honegger's Pacific 231 and all these things, they imprinted on us a kind of idea, this is modern, this mechanical impact of music. And so it was, of course, an idea against human being. It is not anymore with us. It is maybe not against us, but it is something opposing us. And finally, it is against human being if it's very mechanized. And so this became a kind of precondition to be modern. But then, of course, after some time, it is too often repeated, and so something else has to take over. And so, for example, when we had, after the Second World War, the serialism which came out and this total over-regulation of high complexity, at some point, it made no sense anymore for many. And so John Cage came and did just the opposite. And so accidental sounds, also complicated, became the wave against this wave. And Boulez would admit that this kind of accidental complexity and the kind of intentional complexity could finally, for the listener, mean the same. He cannot even distinguish it. So here we are with this. This is just what I say before I come to the point of today, just that we understand that we are always, if we don't care, we are prisoners of some ideas. And so I just give you some examples. At some point, how long is it ago? Almost 30 years ago, a friend presented to me the 3 mantras from the opera Avatara, which is not anymore extant, by John Foulds. John Foulds is a contemporary of Bela Bartok and of Igor Stravinsky. He's born in 1880. He died in 1939. And he wrote a very bright and light, in the best sense, light, not entertaining. Also some such pieces he also wrote, but a very bright vision of mankind is in his music. It's, let's say so, extremely positive and very tender. Not everything, but basically. And Foulds was ingenious, no less than, for example, Stravinsky, in his own way. But it was against the time. And he was absolutely not taken seriously. And when I went deeper into Foulds' music, we found such incredibly beautiful music, like some string quartets that are absolutely beyond any doubt among the greatest compositions for string quartet. Some of the orchestral music, also phenomenally orchestrated, by the way. He was a professional conductor. He was basically a professional cellist. And so this music, which creates a totally other kind of vision in this quite dystopian time between the 2 world wars, where everything was considered as becoming problematic and art also becoming kind of description of the problems of the time, of psychological torments and so on. And Foulds would write a music completely of another kind. We have, of course, then also other composers who do this in their own way. For example, I also think that Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff, together with his pupil Thomas de Hartmann, they also gave a wonderful alternative vision of music, much more simple, but not that simple as many people think, because finally we have very, very long melodic lines which really have to carry through with enough tension, inner tension, and with a long breath. And harmony is extremely simple there. Rhythm also quite, ostinato. But this is much better music than many people think. But then it's not a question of style. So for example, if you find some things, Heinrich Kaminski was a great German composer, born in 1886 and died in 1946, just after the Second World War. And during the Third Reich, he was a persona non grata, he was quarter Jew, as they said. And so it was not forbidden to perform his music, but it was always considered something they don't want. And so his career went down in the Third Reich. And Kaminski, he had his own way of being a progressive, but a totally different kind of progressive than others. Harmony was just in tradition. Kaminski's harmony was going on in the tradition of the Romanticists, but his way of treating meter and rhythm was something totally new, flowing absolutely over the bar lines. So the bar is just only there to have an orientation for playing together, but not to hear anything of it. And so this music would be a kind of almost multi-polyphonic flow over the bar lines. And even his polyphonic invention was like that every instrument had to, in a fugue, had to articulate and to embellish its theme in its individual idiomatic way. So Kaminski wrote phenomenal works. They are horribly complicated, many of them. For example, the Concerto Grosso for double orchestra with piano. It's such a difficult piece that at the time, the conductors, they had a discussion in the magazine Pult und Taktstock, from a magazine by Universal Edition in Vienna. They discussed how to rehearse this work. And the great conductor Franz von Höslin, who did it successfully in Dessau, he gave a detailed outline of how many rehearsals for which group and then bring them together and so on. A thing which is, for example, absolutely impossible in today's United Kingdom and also in Germany. I don't know who could do that. Of course, the orchestra individual players are much better today. In the average orchestra musician, definitely. But to rehearse it, to really understand what you are doing in this polyphony, to hear every important voice in that moment where you have to hear it, it's always going from there to there to there to there. This is a real challenge. And that there are a lot of Kaminski works of high quality, Doric music, so to say, for orchestra. And then there are some with choir. There is a wonderful Magnificat. And there for soprano and solo viola and little orchestra and a choir in the distance. And there is this opera Jurk Janac, which is now for the first time in a new material done by this Heinrich Kaminski Society in Germany. And then we have the late opera, which is not an opera, it's more a kind of ritualist mystery drama in a way like Enescu's Oedipe, or also like Szymanowski's Król Róża. It is called Das Spiel vom König Aphelios, the play of King Aphelios. It's the last work, and it was revised and made ready for print by his pupil Reinhard Schwarz-Schilling. So we have this Kaminski, and we have a Kaminski school. There was a fantastic composer who was very close with him, but then went away. But in the Third Reich, one of the only composers who had the courage to do Kaminski's music as a conductor, it's Heinz Schubert. And he was a phenomenal composer himself, a very ecstatic and very hymnic, like also his teacher, very close in a way, but then in the closeness you hear also the distinguished personalities that are very different of these composers. That is very often so. So you can say that in a way Haydn and Mozart have been close, but in this way that they are sometimes at least very close to each other, you hear immediately who is who. And the same goes with Heinrich Kaminski and his pupil Heinz Schubert. There is a phenomenal recording, not acoustically, it's not phenomenal because it's just a radio recording of the time. Wilhelm Furtwängler in 1942 conducting the Hymnisches Konzert, Hymnic Concerto by Heinz Schubert, with Erna Berger soprano and Walter Ludwig tenor and Fritz Heitmann at the organ and the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. An incredible piece of around 40 minutes in a few sections, sometimes just having a transition from section to section, sometimes having a kind of fermata and going on. A phenomenal piece of the deepest and greatest level of the most in-depth level of German music at the time, in a way very religious but pan-religious, which is the mystery of these composers. They were pan-religious, they were not only Christian, they were interested in Jewish religion, they were interested in Rumi, in Zoroaster, and in the Upanishads. So many things come together, and they wanted to build a new world, but a peaceful world completely beyond this world. And so people would say that they were just they took refuge out of reality. But that's not true. They wanted to build another reality. And there was also the other pupil of Kaminski, Reinhard Schwarz-Schilling, who was personally the closest. There was a fourth one, Horst Günther Schnell, who, like Heinz Schubert, both fell in Second World War. And Horst Günther Schnell, there we have no works that we can find. There are some scores still there, but we did not find them. So it's a great pity. We are still searching for that, and we have to find the people who hold these scores. But Heinz Schubert, he died in the last days of the war. He was sent just to the front without any any professional education as a soldier, just against the Red Army, and these people had no chance. They just died in the field. And so there was Reinhard Schwarz-Schilling, who survived his teacher Kaminski, and who after the war had still 40 years until he died, and who wrote a lot of religious music, a lot of choral music, wonderful songs with piano. We just recorded them on Aldila Records with Stefan Klemm, baritone, and with Christian Lieber, soprano, and with Hartmut Töll at the piano, together with the songs by his teacher Kaminski. But there is by Schwarz-Schilling wonderful orchestral music, the partita, which is quite close to his teacher Kaminski in a kind of almost neo-Baroque manner. But neo-Baroque, what does it mean? It is absolutely full of these expressive devices of the time, but harmony is more going toward Baroque. But then later it would become much more mixed up in Kaminski's, in Schwarz-Schilling's oeuvre, and after the war he wrote his Symphony in C and the Sinfonia Diatonica and his violin concerto, and these works are very interesting. They even go quite away from his teacher. The Symphony in C, for example, is also very interesting in the way he uses tonality. In a way he stays all the time with C, like Sibelius in his seventh. So it's a kind of recurrence on the mother key, and the orchestration is not so easy. It has a kind of real dark orchestration. He's totally another character, much more earthbound than his teacher Kaminski or Heinz Schubert, who was as well a pupil of Kaminski. So you see that they come from one school which nobody knows today, almost nobody knows. There come at least 3 composers, and maybe 4 we don't know about Schnell. And so we have these things, then you find something and you can then relate to something. So at the moment we have Kaminski, we can find out, okay, how are the pupils? There is a famous pupil of Kaminski, Karl Orff, but his music has nothing to do with Kaminski. But Heinz Schubert and Reinhard Schwarz-Schilling. And then we look deeper into this music and we find out what timeless quality it has. And so I can give you many examples, and we will have a lot of other I will give you a lot of other hints to other composers. Today I would go for one more composer, much closer to our time, the French composer Jean-Louis Florentz, with TZ in the end. He was born in 1947, he died in 2014. I will keep it short now with him. We will have a complete Florentz portrait at a later stage. He was a pupil of Messiaen, and he really gave us a kind of crowning fusion of French orchestral music. He went far beyond his teacher, even in the organ music. The organ music of Florentz is much more lively, much more deeply musical than Messiaen's. So Messiaen was a kind of architect, and he was a kind of, he was very principled. So he would use these modes, and he would write in these modes. He would use some artificial rhythms, very interestingly combined, even in the at the beginning in the Turanga Lila Symphony, he would do that. And we see in the Turanga Lila Symphony a bit the greatness and the limits of Messiaen. So when Serge Koussevitzky first heard the Turanga Lila Symphony, he would say, this is the greatest work in 20th century music since Le Sacre du Printemps. And when you hear it for the first time, this can be your impression. It's extremely impressive. But when you hear it more often, there is something also a bit empty inside. That's what I mean. So many people will maybe oppose to that, and okay, we can discuss it. But I think that Messiaen, behind very interesting sound and very interesting structure, is not so much a real living being that we can connect with. So it is more, it stays always interesting. And we in a way, stay always distant to it. Fascinating distance. So Florentz would take us immediately. And you only have to listen, for example, to this quite late work by Florentz, L'Anneau de Salomon, The Ring of Solomon, which is an orchestra piece of 30 minutes, like a mosaic built on some recurring themes. And so it's very interesting. It's a very interesting form. It totally works as one organic unity in a lot of contrasting sections. And it shows us that this man who studied with Messiaen and learned everything from him, he also learned everything from Debussy and from Ravel and from all these greats of French orchestral culture. And then he would write a music that unites the great French orchestral sound, absolutely unmistakably French, with African rhythm and with modes from Minor Asia and from North African Arab regions. And all this intermingles into a completely new and transcendent style of utmost beauty and a great way of building a totally typical, I would say, French form. But you could also say a form which is reminiscent of Sufi stories, like there is a story inside a story inside a story. So it is this kind of microcosm in macrocosm, and everything just in different time spaces at the same time. That's absolutely one of the most marvelous composers of the second half of the 20th century, almost totally unknown, even in France, and therefore, of course, also outside of France. Most of his music has never been played outside of France, and there are only 18 opus numbers. He would be extremely considerate, but you can say that there are not many pieces. I mean, it took years for one piece. That is a thing he has in common with Henri Dutilleux. And that's true. Dutilleux became much older, and the later the work by Dutilleux is, the less music is created in the more time he needed for it. And so Dutilleux was fantastic. I think the first symphony, Métabole, second symphony, which is very experimental but extremely interesting, Mystère de l'instant, the cello concerto Tout d'un monde lointain, the violin concerto L'Arbre des Anges, and all these things. He's a phenomenal composer, the string quartet and so on. But there is one thing you see in Dutilleux's music which is a problem. He gets so occupied with detail more and more because he doesn't want to repeat himself, that you feel a bit that the zest for life is a bit reduced, and particularly the later the works are. I cannot really feel it in Métabole, but later I have the feeling that the music is not anymore so much full of life and full-blooded. And the music by Florentz, even if he didn't write many works and it took him a long time, they are always like just happening from one flow of imagination and of inspiration, which is absolutely incredible. And these are examples of great music, great composers who are totally unknown, but wrote really substantial music. There are many more, and we always have to pick something where we find, we hear something we did not experience anywhere else. And it can be totally different. It can be in a totally normal tonal language, for example, but something inside this language is very new, like with the Dresden composer Paul Büttner. I will also speak about him soon a bit more in detail. It's suddenly the form that is totally new and that is very individual. It can be like with Kaminski, the way of handling counterpoint and of handling freedom with rhythm, with meter, with flowing rhythm. It can be, as is in Florentz music a totally new fusion of best French orchestral music or organ music, and of African rhythm, and of Minor Asia, North African Arab tone systems, or it can be like in John Foulds music. It's not so much in Foulds, also he wrote music in Indian style and these things, but it is more this kind of music of bliss in a time of dystopia, and bliss which doesn't mean at all kitsch. It's just the reality he envisioned. And so all these things, you find something that is different from normal. Because of course we have also lots of composers who are just writing in the style of, but we have to distinguish. Some things are always in the style of, almost always. And some things are new. It's not always as obviously new as it was with the music by Claude Debussy or by Leos Janáček. This is something else. They created really a new world from the core in many ways. But to create a new world is also only one thing we can take as a perspective. So Mozart didn't have to create a new world, but inside the world he found, he would bring incredible things together. Then also later studying Bach and having this kind of counterpoint and all these things. So he would just get his own vision also, of course, with this fantastic craft of a unique world. And so it stays a challenge to find unknown music of real substance. But it is possible, and it is possible to become more and more secure in finding that. See you soon. Bye.